Hello, welcome. My name is Ileana, and I'm a librarian at the San Francisco Public Library. I am so glad that you're here with us for our second author event in our series, The Golden Door Meets the Golden Gate, in partnership with the New York Public Library and the San Francisco Unified School District Libraries. This program is live streaming from San Francisco, California. I'm going to share a land acknowledgement to raise awareness and offer gratitude. The area now known as San Francisco is the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the original peoples of this land, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place. We recognize that we benefit from living, working, and learning on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. I encourage you to learn about the land you reside or the land that you visit. There are resources in the chat and at your local library. I'm very happy to introduce Elizabeth Bevington, Senior Librarian at the Chatham Square Library of the New York Public Library. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for being here today and for the intro, Ileana. We're very thankful to our partnership with the San Francisco Public Library, San Francisco Unified School District Libraries, the Chatham Square and Seward Park Libraries of the New York Public Library to bring this special series to students, educators, and our communities. Student book groups from San Francisco's Marina, Herbert Hoover and Roosevelt middle schools, along with students from New York City's PS 184 and PS 126, have been discussing two books in this series, The Golden Door Meets the Golden Gate. In this series, students and educators have connected with their bi-coastal peers and are participating in virtual author talks based in San Francisco, Chinatown, and New York City's Chinatown. In preparation for the author visit, educators and youth developed discussion questions about the themes and of each of the books. Watch last month's author event with Ed Lin, author of David Tung Can't Get a Girlfriend Until He Gets into an Ivy League College, set in present-day New York, Chinatown, and New Jersey on YouTube. Here is a map of San Francisco with our schools Marina and Roosevelt and Hoover marked. Here is a map of New York City with our schools PS 184 and PS 126 marked. Before we start our conversation, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement recognizing the traditional indigenous inhabitants of where I'm located in New York City, the unceded Munsee Lenape homelands. If you know the tribes that traditionally lived in the area where you are, we invite you to introduce yourself and those tribes in the chat box. There is an interactive map where we can provide a link in the chat. It's a great resource to see the history of the land and ongoing legacies of the peoples that have and continue to call these lands home. It's now my pleasure to introduce Malinda Lo, the author of today's book. She's a New York Times bestselling author of Last Night at the Telegraph Club, winner of the National Book Award, the Stonewall Book Award, and the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, as well as the Michael L. Prince and Walter D. Myers honors. Her debut novel, Ash, is a sapphic retelling of Cinderella, was a finalist for the William C. Morris YA Debut Award, the Andre Norton Award for YA Science Fiction and Fantasy, the Mythopoeic Fantasy Award, and the Lambda Literary Award. Melinda's short fiction and nonfiction have been published by the New York Times, NPR, Autostraddle, The Horn Book, and multiple anthologies. She lives in Massachusetts with her wife and their dog. San Francisco librarians created this map with place markers to set the scene for us. Here we have our setting, San Francisco and two neighborhoods, Chinatown and North Beach. In this map here, we have places of interest in the novel, along with the New York City schools represented and libraries. Malinda Lo has a phenomenal blog post, A Guide to Lily's San Francisco, on her website with more details and mapping, which we'll add to the chat. Now we're very excited to welcome Malinda Lo.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Ileana, New York Public Library and San Francisco Public Library, for inviting me here to talk with you all today. This is great. I love all these maps.
Thank you so much. So I think if maybe you want a little bit to talk about, since you mentioned the map specifically, your connection to San Francisco and your choice of this setting for the book. We had a few questions from our students about that.
Oh, sure. So the book is set in San Francisco because, okay, so let me backtrack a little bit. So Last Night at the Telegraph Club is a novel, obviously, but it started out as a short story. The short story was called New Year, and it was published in an anthology called All Out: The No Longer Secret Stories of Queer Teens Throughout the Ages. And that short story was inspired by two nonfiction books that I had been reading. Rise of the Rocket Girls by Natalia Holt, which is about the women computers who worked at the Jet Propulsion Lab in the 1940s and 50s. It was also inspired by Wide Open Town by Nan Elamilla Boyd, which is a history of queer San Francisco. So I was reading these two books around the same time. They don't have anything to do with each other, but in my head, they came together to create the character Lily, a 17-year-old Chinese American girl who lives in San Francisco and is just fascinated by rocket science. So you can kind of see how those books stimulated those various inspirations in me. So for me, it was always going to be set in San Francisco, and it was always going to be set in the 50s, because in Wide Open Town, the 1950s actually were a period in San Francisco's history when there was a very lively gay bar scene. And that gay bar scene was mostly located in North Beach, which is right next door to Chinatown. So to me, it seemed like a very fertile area for cross-pollination. You know, I kind of imagined if Lily was living in Chinatown, she could literally look across Broadway and across Columbus Avenue and see North Beach. You know, she could see those gay bars and vice versa. So I always kind of wondered, did anyone who lived there at the time go in between these communities, because they're so close to each other? And it seemed to me that that was just a perfect place to set a story. So that's how it started. And I wrote this short story, and then my literary agent actually persuaded me that it could be a novel. He pointed out that I had done so much research for this short story. Clearly, I was really fascinated by this. And I realized as I thought about it that I had a lot more to say about Lily. And that's where the novel began.
Can you talk a little bit? We had some students that were curious about your process. And obviously, this is a really well-researched book. For anyone who hasn't seen it or read it or just didn't go that far back, there is some really good informative back matter and works cited, which librarians always appreciate. Can you talk a little bit about how, you know, what your process maybe looks like generally and how it was different for this book? You know, you're not inventing a world, you're basing it in a very real world.
Yeah, so it is different for every single book. I know writers say that all the time, but it's very irritatingly true. So with this book, I had never written a historical novel before, so I had to learn how to write a historical novel. It was a lot of work. You know, I really knew nothing about the 1950s when I started working on this book. It wasn't a period that I had been particularly interested in for any reason. But once I started digging into this decade, it was very fascinating to me. One of the most interesting aspects of research for this book, so let me just say, I allowed myself to do about 6 months of research into the 1950s and Chinatown and LGBT history at the time. I did that for about probably 6 months before I started writing. I continued to research while I was writing and all the way through multiple drafts and copy editing even. In fact, I was fact checking all the way to the very end, really. But I made myself start writing at a certain point, because you can just research forever. But that's not necessary. If you don't stop researching and start writing, the book will never get written. You know? basic tip. So one of the things that was fascinating with this research is the most important question I had to answer was, what was it like to be a Chinese American lesbian teen in 1950s San Francisco? This is a very specific question, and there are no answers to this in the historical research, okay? Because there's lots of history about Chinese Americans, there's lots of history about San Francisco, there's lots of history about LGBT history, but they don't intersect in most of the archives. So what I had to do was research each of these areas separately and kind of combine them together in my imagination to create this character and her world. And now I can go on forever, but I can't remember what the question was.
But that's a great segue into, you created this character in their world. Obviously, there's a very real factual basis for the world, but you did have to invent these people. So a few specific questions. One of our students asked, which character in Last Night at the Telegraph Club do you relate to the most? And then we had some other kind of more general inspiration questions we can get to.
Yeah, this is a question I get all the time, which is very interesting because I have written, this is my sixth novel. Telegraph Club is my sixth novel, my sixth published novel. I have written more novels that have not been published. And I really identify with every single character I have ever written. So that's a lot of characters, right? And as an author, what you're trying to do is put yourself in the shoes of each character in the story. So I'm always trying to empathize with people and these characters and see how they might feel in certain situations. I'm always trying to understand the context of their lives, every single character's lives. And that gives me insight into how they might react in a certain situation, how they might feel about things. So I think that a lot of readers think that the author is primarily identified with the protagonist in the book. And that may be true for some writers. It's not usually true for me. I think that I really love getting into the minds of all of the characters, and I really empathize with all of them, even the ones that readers often dislike. I feel very fondly toward. So in this book, I think that, I identify with aspects of Lily's character. Identity-wise, we are similar in that we're Chinese American, we're both queer, but I grew up in the 80s in Colorado in a very white community, so I did not have Lily's community around her. I was not obsessed with rocket science the way she is. I did not exactly love math. So that was kind of, I'm fascinated by it, but Lily really likes math. And I didn't love it. I did it, but it wasn't my thing, So, I identify with aspects of her personality. I identify with aspects of Shirley, her best friend, and I identify with aspects of, actually Kath probably I don't identify with. I think that Kath is very different from me, but I have a lot of friends who are like Kath. So I think I put those friends into her in a way. And, I understand Lily's mom. I understand where she comes from. I identify with her mom and her dad too. I'm older now. And so I don't have kids of my own, but I can see what it's like to be living for longer. The longer you're alive, you have similar experiences no matter where you are. So that's a long, convoluted answer to that question.
I think that you touched on a lot of kind of what the students were getting at in their questions. We always want to know, what inspirations did you draw from your real life? Do you know anyone like these people? And in your book, and as well as the Ed Lin book that we read, the protagonist's family is a really important, part of what's happening in that person's inner world. They're obviously a really informative sort of set of characters. You talked a little bit about empathizing with the characters that maybe people don't like as much. And I would say Shirley is maybe one of those characters. And we had a student,
I know.
We had a student who specifically wanted to know what the inspiration for her was, because she's, like all of them, very complicated, but certainly someone who you wouldn't necessarily want to be like.
Well, the thing is, what I was thinking about Shirley and Lily as friends is that they grew up together. They were in a small community together. I feel like the neighborhood of Chinatown, San Francisco in the 1950s was very close and tightly linked. And Lily and Shirley grew up in the same church. They went to the same Chinese school. They went to the same elementary school. Their families knew each other. They were kind of in the same class of Chinese Americans in Chinatown. Shirley's parents are restaurant owners, so they're in the merchant class. Basically, they're kind of the middle class in Chinatown. And Lily's father is a doctor, so they're kind of professionals, and so their families have a lot of interaction. And so when you grow up with someone, you might become friends with them when you're like 4 or 5 years old, and then you grow up together and you have that long history of being friends, but your interests will start to diverge. I mean, they often do as you grow older, but you're still kind of stuck together because you're in the same place. You're still in the same classes all the way through high school. And I know that for me, I had childhood friends that I met when I was like 4 or 5, 6, and I was still friends with them all the way through middle school and high school, even when we became very different people and our friendships became much more strained, frankly, because we didn't have necessarily the same interests, but we were still friends because we were just there together. It wasn't until I left for college and had the opportunity to meet more people and be an adult in the world and choose my friends more carefully. That's when I was able to make really close lifelong friendships with people because I was able to choose them. But when you're just in this one community together, growing up together with your friends you've known since you were 5, there's not a lot of choice. And so I think that's what their friendship was like for me.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things, this is in many ways a sort of coming of age novel, and Lily is just starting to exercise her autonomy in many ways, but including socially. And a lot of our students, I know, occupy many disparate worlds in terms of the people who they're interacting with. Many of them go to Chinese school, in addition to, their regular Monday through Friday public schools that they attend. And some of our students would like to know, did you go to Chinese school? And what was your life growing up?
Oh yeah, I totally went to Chinese school. It was, I went to Chinese school all the way through middle school, probably. This was in Colorado, so it was a very small Chinese school, but and there were only a few. It wasn't large, so we knew everyone there. Our parents knew each other, and that was interesting because in school in Colorado, it was very white. So in my class, I was one of only 3 Asian American students, and we all knew each other. We weren't friends necessarily, but one of them actually emailed me after I won the National Book Award and to say congratulations. And I was so amazed that I wasn't amazed that she remembered me because I remembered her because we were the only 2 2 Chinese American, students in our class. But it was really wonderful that she looked me up, and her parents still kind of know my family. So it was there weren't very many of us Asian Americans, but we did go to Chinese school together. And I really found Chinese school interesting, but also it was so separate from my regular school life that I don't think it gave me a really great sense of Chinese community. Because generally speaking, 95% of the time or more, I was in my all-white school. And but when I went to college, I also took Chinese. I majored in Chinese studies. I ended up getting a master's degree in East Asian studies. And I spent a lot of time studying Chinese. And I did have that basis in Chinese school, I have to say, because when I went to college, I could write some stuff because of Chinese school. However, as an adult, I'm very sorry to report that my Chinese is terrible and I have forgotten so much of it. I can barely read it. And it's just one of those things. If you don't use it every day, you forget it. Yeah. So
I'm sure that many of our students have heard that from their parents. So
yes, it's true. They're not lying to you. I hate to tell you the truth.
Let's see. I don't know. We have a couple of comments from YouTube and I think some questions in a Q&A box. I don't know if we're gonna get towards those at the end or if we want to get to some of those now. But we have a question in our Q&A. This is fully a pivot from Chinese school. But is there an actual Telegraph Club in San Francisco like the one in the book?
No, it's fictional, but it is based in a lot of the real gay and lesbian bars that existed in San Francisco in the 1940s and 50s. So that book that I mentioned, Wide Open Town, it's an academic history book, but it goes into so much wonderful history about the gay bar scene in San Francisco, and many of them, they inspired the Telegraph Club, right down to the way that the bar looks, which I have to tell you, it was fascinating to me because when I read about it, so the way these bars looked at the time, they were built a certain way, right? You come in the front door and there's a very long hallway, well, it's a long room where the bar is. So it's a narrow space. You have to walk right past that bar because the bartender can then see you coming in. So this was a security situation so that the bartender could see who was entering the bar. And at the back, so this long room would then lead into a bigger room in the back where they would have tables or a stage, you know, for a show. And there would always be a back door in case the bar was raided, so you could escape. And this is the way that many of the bars that still exist in San Francisco, especially in the gay areas of the town, that's the way they look today, even. And they were built that way for a reason. So when I lived in San Francisco and in the early 2000s and I was going to gay bars, a lot of them were like that. They had that exact same layout. So when I read Wide Open Town and learned that, and then I could think about my own experiences going to those bars, it really helped me to write the Telegraph Club, the fictional Telegraph Club, because I felt like I had been in those spaces because they still exist. It's really incredible to think about the legacy of those architectural buildings and the culture that they have enfolded and created over the decades.
It's so, I'm really happy to hear you say that, because I think there is, you know, obviously we think a lot about our queer ancestors, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P., but the places are so important, you know, the physical space, the geography of our history is really so meaningful. So I think that's a very special aspect of this book. I'm really glad that you addressed. You know, in thinking a lot about this book, and again, the history, the cultural context and setting, community is really important for queer individuals presently and in the past, and also family. And we had some students who wanted to know, you know, who some of your biggest supporters and cheerleaders and part of your community in the sort of genesis and publication of this book were.
Well, in this book in particular, my parents were extremely helpful to me because they speak Chinese fluently. So they helped me to write all the Chinese dialogue in the book. So in the book, there are some sections that are actually in Chinese, which I made the decision to put Chinese characters in the book to reflect the fact that Chinese is a full language. So often in English books, English language books, foreign languages are italicized. And so I did not italicize them in this book, for one thing, because I wanted them to just be a language, not a special situation. I also chose to use Chinese characters instead of Romanizing in certain situations, because Romanizing Chinese is very complicated. And the way it's presented in most English language books is not complete. And if you read the incomplete romanization of a Chinese word, you have no idea what it is. So I wanted to make sure that readers could see that it was a whole word and a whole language. And so my parents helped me to write those, and they were so wonderful. So when I grew up as a kid, my parents always told me that I could not be a writer. I have distinct memories of them telling me, you cannot be a writer. And I wanted to be a writer my whole life, but they always told me I couldn't be one. And I know that that's because they are immigrants and they wanted me to have a good life, not a life of struggle. They knew that I would have to pay the rent. And, you know, they were telling me this for a reason, and I respect that reason, but, you know, I wanted to be a writer. So it took me a long time to get to the place that I am at now. And my parents were right. It was a struggle, and it was really hard to pay the rent at times in my career. So I understand why they said that. And it took them a while for them to come around to the idea of me being a writer, but they've definitely come around to it now. Since, I mean, they helped me write this book. And my mom speaks English as a second language. She came to this country in her late 20s, early 30s, and so she had to learn English as an adult. So she read this whole book. This is the first book of mine that she has read. So I feel really grateful to her for taking the time to do that, you know, and I'm really happy that she did that. I'm also terrified because that means she might try to read my other books now. I don't know if you really want your parents to read your books. Like it's on the one hand, it's very lovely. On the other hand, it's very scary. So I don't know, but they've been great supporters with this book.
That's, I think also as part of our ongoing conversation and families being so much a part of both of the novels, I hope that's a valuable takeaway for some of our students. It's in addition to, well, I guess I would like to say one of the notable features of your book was that you didn't romanize characters, that there wasn't italicization of the text. And there are many, many aspects of this book that are really exceptional in the context of a wider body of young adult literature and historical fiction specifically, a lot of which is, you know, there's lots of historical romance, there's lots of like not very interesting or stuff that's very well-trod territory, the Revolutionary War. You know, we've read many of these things over and over again. And you've gotten some recognition, obviously, for this book being an exceptional book. So obviously you won the 2021 National Book Award for Young People's Literature. How did that feel?
That was surreal. I mean, first of all, no one becomes a writer with the goal of winning the National Book Award. Like, this is not a thing. I don't think it's a thing you think is possible. Okay, like this didn't even occur to me that this was a possibility. So it was totally shocking when it was longlisted. I didn't know the long list was coming up because I purposely did not pay attention to when award announcements were going to happen, because that's just very stressful. So I remember my editor called me one morning and he was like, "Congratulations." And I was like, "For what?" I had no idea. So, but then I paid attention afterward. It was totally surreal, and really, it has changed my career. I have to say, like, it has totally changed the way I think my books are perceived, or it has changed the degree to which my books are perceived. You know, like, plenty of people have read my books before, and I know I've had some wonderful dedicated fans for years, but the degree of the number of people who have learned about me since then has been incredible. It's been incredible, and it continues to change the way my career is going. It's just amazing. So I'm very grateful to those judges for choosing my book.
It's very exciting to see. I can only imagine what it actually feels like. I remember when Ash came out, and there was a lot of love for it in the library community as being, you know, an exciting original work. So to see you getting the accolades that I'm sure many of us have felt like you deserve for a long time is a really special. You talked a little bit about, you know, some of your educational background and wanting to be a writer from a young age, but you've had some moves in your career, and obviously it's taken some turns now. One of our YouTube viewers would like to know kind of how your career has shifted, what your path from wannabe writer as a youth to like real life award-winning author as an adult, what that trajectory has looked like?
Well, it's definitely been a little convoluted because I started, even though I wanted to be a writer, I didn't know how I could do that. So I went to college and I double majored in Chinese studies and economics. So I had this idea that I would be an investment banker. This is the 90s. So I was going to be an investment banker. And one of the stories that I tell all the time, so I'm sorry if this is a repeat for anyone, but one of the bankers who interviewed me my senior year in college said, "I'm very sorry you didn't get the job." He called me to tell me this, but good luck in your career as a writer. So I had clearly talked about how much I wanted to be a writer and not a banker in that interview, which don't do that. If you're interviewing for a job, don't tell them you want to do something else. But I didn't become a writer, even though I didn't get the banking job. I ended up moving to New York after graduation, and I got a job as an editorial assistant at Ballantine Books, an imprint of Random House. This is before it was Penguin Random House. So I worked there for a couple of years, and it was funny because it was like I was so close to writers, but I was not one, and I just hated it. I was like, I don't want to be on this side of the desk. I want to be on the other side. So did I become a writer? No. I went to grad school and I got my master's degree in East Asian Studies. And then I got into a PhD program to do a PhD in cultural anthropology. So I had this idea that I would be a professor and I could like write during the summers. I'm sure if there are any professors out there, they're laughing their heads off right now. So I was in grad school for like 4 years when I realized I hated academia. And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to be a freelance writer because you know what? Being a freelance writer actually would make me about the same amount of money or more than being a grad student. So it was not a drop in income to drop out of grad school. And so I did that. And I didn't really know what being a freelance writer meant. I didn't do any research into it because, I probably would have been too scared to do it if I had tried to research it. So I just dropped out of grad school. And I'm very fortunate. I had a couple of friends. One of them worked for a consulting company and she hired me to write reports for her consulting company. So I was definitely being a writer, even though I was writing business reports. And then I had another friend who was starting a website. This was the dawn of the internet. She called me. She's like, "I'm starting this website. It's going to be like a lesbian entertainment weekly. Do you want to write for it? Since you dropped out of grad school to be a writer." So nobody read her website at this time. So I said, sure, because I had nothing else to do. And I wrote an article about Ellen DeGeneres. And I kept writing freelance articles for her. I started freelancing for other LGBT media publications. And her website grew and grew, and it was acquired by MTV. And I ended up working full-time for it. And I was a full-time entertainment reporter for several years. And at that time, I was reporting on the representation of lesbians and bisexual women in entertainment. I watched a lot of the L Word, the first version. I wrote way too many articles about the L Word.
Thank you.
I mean, at the same time, I was working on Ash, my retelling of Cinderella. So I wrote that while I was being an entertainment reporter. Mm-hmm. And then once Ash sold, I haven't really looked back. I mean, I started writing novels. So it was, I always wanted to be a writer. So I always had the kind of writing on the sidelines to some degree, but it took me a while to get here. Ash was published when I was in my 30s. So, a lot of people I see on the internet are like, "I'm 25, I haven't published a novel, it's too late." And I'm just like, no, it's not too late. And my grandmother, my father's mother, she published a memoir in 1980 about my family's time in China during the Cultural Revolution. And she was in her 60s or 70s at that point, in her 60s. So it's never too late. Also not too early. I'm sure you're all very young. So I'm just saying you can start now.
Aragon or something wasn't Chris Paolini like 16 or 17 when that book was published? Like,
I wrote 3 novels when I was a teen in high school. I wrote 3 complete fantasy novels. I have parts of them because, you know, back then you had to print them out on a dot matrix printer,
yeah.
and I would run out of paper and ink, couldn't get to them all. But I'm very glad that I did not publish them and that there was no self-publishing at the time.
Is it possible that we'll ever see a reworking of any of those?
No, never.
Okay.
I'm very glad they're on, but sometimes I do conventions and they have these places, these events where you read your juvenilia, like stuff you wrote when you were a teenager. And I have read excerpts of them aloud, and there people laugh. They think it is so funny. Because it is.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Maybe it'll happen, or they'll, you know, get held in your collection of your papers at Wellesley or something like that. We'll just have to. So we're gonna maybe start wrapping up a little bit, but we do have a question from an attendee here in the Q&A box. They say, I thought it was so appropriate that Lily put the newspaper clipping in the book Exploration of Space, given that the exploration of queer spaces is a queer theme of the book. And our viewer wants to know if that was intentional or a happy accident.
Well, you know, that was a suggestion. Well, you see, this book, I worked on this book for like 3 years, and sometimes I think I understand or remember what happened, and sometimes I'm not sure if I remember correctly. So the clippings in the book, it was my editor who suggested that Lily might collect different clippings from various places, and I can't remember if he suggested that she put them in the book, because I believe maybe initially she only had the newspaper ad for the Telegraph Club, and she did put that in the book. The book was an interesting discovery that I made during my research, because I wanted to know what people thought about space in 1954. So I had to find a book about space from the 1950s to read, because I didn't want to have, you know, current knowledge about space in the book. It had to be only what they knew in the 1950s. And Arthur C. Clarke is the person who wrote that book. And I loved his books when I was a teen, and I was amazed to discover that he had written this book. And he had also written several columns in 17 magazine in the 1950s, which was a shocking discovery to me.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't know either. And he's a very clear writer. And so I found a copy of The Exploration of Space on the internet, and I bought it. And weirdly, the person who sold it to me lives in my town, and they walked it over to my house. So I have this book now, and it just seemed like this is a book that Lily would use to put things in. I thought she'd have to hide it someplace that no one would go, you know? So who's gonna look at this book called The Exploration of Space in her house? No one but her. So that's why she hides it in there.
Thank you so much. That is a great question. And we're so appreciative of your coming to visit with us, talking a little bit about your book and about yourself. Yeah, I feel like a little awestruck. I don't know how our students are feeling, but we're so grateful for your coming to talk to us, being so generous with your time. Just a reminder to everyone who's with us today that you can find both Ed Lin's book that we talked about last month and Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo, as well as Ash and many of her other books at your local San Francisco Public Library and New York Public Library location. If you enjoyed today's program and you would like to watch it again, you can visit the San Francisco Public Library's YouTube channel, and I think that we may have a link available in the chat. But yeah, we're so grateful for your visiting with us today, and hope that everyone takes care of themselves, stay safe, and see you virtually soon.
Thank you so much, everyone.